My name is Jim Leach. I was with Benson's in the 1980s. I was initially hired as the magician. I did 4 magic shows a day down where the 9/11 memorial is now. It had a little stage, and I did 4 shows a day there, and that was my initial job. That's what I was supposed to do. Cool job. I was very happy doing it. Loved doing it. But between shows, I would just hang around in the elephant barn, because ever since I was a kid, they were my favorite animals. In fact, the first time I ever came here was as a kid, first grade field trip. And I came in here, and Liz, Queen, and Ruth at the time were the 3 elephants. And I was just so fascinated by these enormous animals and how cool they were. So between shows, I was just hanging around here, and at that point I was a teenager, 1981, and I think everyone that worked in the barn kind of found me just kind of a pesty kid. I was here all the time. Eventually they talked me into doing the ringmastering. So in addition to the 4 magic shows a day, I was doing the announcements, introducing the elephant show, and also there was a little comedy bit in between where I would speak to the trainer and speak to one of the elephants. And it was just wonderful, wonderful memories. And apparently the park, at that time, Arthur Provencher was the owner. The park kind of liked the idea of having an announcer, so I ended up announcing for the Sea Lion show as well. I was in the daily parade. Arthur usually on weekends rode Liz in the parade throughout the park, but on the weekdays I got to. So I got to ride in the parade, wave at everybody, and that was fun. So I was here starting in high school, and my last year here was actually the last year the park was open when they changed it from Benson's to New England Play World. It was just great. At that time I was again still doing the magic shows, of course, announcing for the elephant show, and I was assisting in the chimpanzee act. So it was quite an experience. When I tell stories to people I know now, and at this point in my life I've lived several places in the country and been all around the world doing my magic, I just mention, some of my stories and they think I'm lying. Because who has these kinds of stories? Who played with tiger cubs? Who was bitten by an elephant? Well, it was technically my second quote-unquote real job. I started doing magic when I was 9 years old, and started making money at it at like 10 or 11 years old, doing birthday parties and things like that. I discovered at a young age, I had a magician's magazine, and in there I'd see advertisements for magic shops and exotic places I'd never been, like New York. And it turns out I saw an ad in there for a magic shop in Nashua. And I thought, oh my God, there's a magic shop in Nashua? And similar to hanging around the barn here, I was just there every Saturday from open to close until the owner put me to work. He started off briefly, he'd say, hey James, I need to go to the store. You mind watching the shop for an hour? Sure. And eventually, that was my first quote-unquote job, but this was my first real job. But everybody I knew already knew that I was a magician. So at that time, it didn't seem like an unusual job when I talked about it then. Well, it starts before I was born, actually. My parents met here. My parents were working here in the 1950s, and my mom actually had a couple of dates with my dad's brother. After going home and meeting the folks and so forth, she ended up liking my dad better. And if it wasn't for Benson's, I wouldn't even be here. So the story actually starts before I ever set foot on the place. But again, I came here as a kid on my first grade field trip. I've always loved animals, but I've always had a particular, just elephants. I've always liked elephants. I've collected little elephant figurines since I was a kid. I've just always loved them. And being here was just the most awesome thing. Especially that young. I was doing, magic shows, hanging around elephants, playing with animals. I also, at that time, took up photography, so I've got albums full of pictures of this place, and I got a paycheck every week. I got paid to have fun. Beat that, right? Strangely, almost everyone I've met that's into magic has the same story. We got a magic trick when we were a kid and just never grew out of it. And that's what I did. Like I said, before I knew that there was a magic shop in town, you meet any magician, whether they're a professional or a hobbyist, and just walk up to them and say 793.8, and they'll know what you're talking about. That's where the magic books are at the library. In the Dewey Decimal System, 793.8. If you could put a point on your license plate, that would be on my car. 793.8, that's just code. Every magician knows what that is. So I took every book out of the library. I suppose the statute of limitations has run out. One of them I never returned simply because I thought this particular book was just far too good stuff for the general public to have, and I wanted to keep it to myself. I didn't want anybody else to know the secrets that were in that book. Yeah, I brought a couple things with me that were kind of interesting. I don't remember where I acquired this. Well, I know where I acquired it, duh. But when I worked here in '87, and when they finally shut down forever, I was actually living here at the park that last season. I was living in the Benson house up here. I had a room there, and I think I found it in there. And once again, the statute of limitations has run out. That was the year they announced they were closing, and I thought, I'm taking this. But what it was is not just a sign. When they had their costume characters walking around the park, in the pre-Mighty Mouse days, they had very nicely made Jackie the Elephant and Mr. Elegant the Giraffe. And they would go around posing for pictures, and they always had one of these. So they'd hold it up, that way they got their plug out there. And like I said, it was in the room that I was living in, and I took it with me. The other thing I brought is post-Benson's, but Benson's related. So I have to go back before this, before I show it to you. In 1992, and no, I'm not going to get political, but in 1992, Bill Clinton was challenging George Bush, and Bill Clinton's advisor was James Carville, and George Bush's advisor was Mary Madeline. Eventually, even though they were on opposite sides, they fell in love and got married, and they wrote a book called All's Fair: Love, War, and Running for President, I think was the subtitle. Several years after Benson's closed, again, now we're in 1994, that's when the book was published, and Newsweek had a rather large excerpt of it. And I was standing there with my fiance at the time, we weren't married yet, standing at the checkout line, living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I saw this magazine on the newsstand promoting the book with the excerpt. And we're standing there at the checkout line, and I said to her, "That's Tanya." And she looked at me like I was crazy. She's like, "How could you recognize an elephant? They all look alike." And so I bought the magazine, I went home, and I called Brett. And I said, well, first thing I did was look through here at the photo credits, and it tells me the photographer and this and that, but it didn't mention anything about the animal. But I knew that was Tanya. So I called Brett, and he answered the phone, and I said, that's Tanya on Newsweek, isn't it? And he said, yeah. And he told me the whole story about taking her to New York for the photo shoot and meeting the Carvilles, and it was a pretty good time. But my wife thought I was nuts. My wife thought I was nuts, that I would recognize an elephant I hadn't seen in several years. So many years later, I had moved at that point from Atlanta to Chicago to Las Vegas, and I was living back in Georgia to Florida, and then back in Georgia again. And I walked into the living room, my wife was watching Oprah, and she was interviewing curators at the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee. And she was interviewing one of the curators via satellite. So the curator is in the foreground, and in the background, 100 or more feet away, are a bunch of elephants grazing. And I walked in, and I saw it, and of course, I focused right on the TV because I love elephants. And I'm watching it for a minute, and I said to my wife, I said, "That's Liz. I used to ride her in the parade every day at Benson's." And how dare she, after the magazine issue, how dare she question my authority on such a thing? But Liz actually, at a young age, had an injured trunk. It was paralyzed. She could work the end of it, but she couldn't lift it. So the way she ate was she would grab hay with the tip of her trunk and swing her head like a little ring toss game and catch the food in her mouth. So I see her in the background, and again, she's on a TV this big, but the elephant's only that big in the background. And I described to my wife exactly how Liz was going to eat. And sure enough, she did that. So my wife was like, yeah, whatever. But later that day I went online and I Googled Liz the elephant, and that brought me to their website. and sure enough, had her bio, and once again, I was right. And at that point, 87, 97, 2007, so it had been 30 years since I'd seen Liz. And, but still, they say elephants don't forget. People don't forget elephants either. So the park closed in 1987. That was my last year here. Shortly thereafter, I moved to Portland, Maine. I was doing magic up there. I always loved New Hampshire, but I've always hated winter. If it could snow and be 70 degrees, I'd be fine. So it's not the cold, it's not the snow, it's the cold. I hate the cold. And ever since I was a kid, I said, when I grow up, I'm getting out of here. So in 1992, I moved to Atlanta. I'd come back to visit family every now and then, but the park had already been closed for a few years, and I used to come here very frequently to visit Brett, Bronson, and the elephants that were still here, Tanya, and at that point, I think he had 3 others. And again, I could come and go as I pleased, because I love, Brett's a very, very good friend. And again, you asked me earlier about just memories of the park. In addition to my parents meeting here, I've made lifelong friends. I've got friends that I'm still in touch with on a very regular basis. Some of them I had lost track of, but through the magic of Facebook, we're all still, I probably got at least a dozen close personal friends that I met from working here. Okay, so I mentioned that when I travel around and I tell some of my stories, people think I'm making them up. And one of my favorites is back when I first started here in 1981, I think. The stage was kind of unusual. It was the performing area of the stage had a curtain and a dressing room and a place to keep my rabbits and doves. But it was almost like a tree house. It was a series of, its footprint was probably only 4 or 5 feet square. And it got bigger, and it had a fence around it because they would put different animals underneath there. Just the giant tortoises were sometimes down there, and at this particular time they had baby ostriches living underneath my stage. So I was doing a trick where I have a can and a handkerchief and a wand. Actually 2 handkerchiefs, but that's not relevant to this. So I would drape the handkerchief over the can and use the wand to poke it in there. And I'm doing the show, and I poke the handkerchief into the can, and when I took the magic wand out, somehow the handkerchief had gotten snagged on the end of the wand. So I'm standing there with a can in one hand, a wand in the other, and out there about 12 inches away hanging off is the handkerchief. So I went to reach for it, and it dislodged, and being made of silk, it drifted, and I'm trying to catch it, and it drifted off the stage and landed in the ostrich area. And at that time, my friend Eric Heath, he was playing the part of Benson, the park clown. And I saw him walking behind the bleachers, and he had stopped to look at the show for a few minutes, and he saw this happen. And I'm like, because the ostrich comes over and a couple of them start pecking at it. I said, Benny! And he came running down through the audience, and he jumped over the fence, and at the second he got over the fence, the ostrich stood up with my handkerchief hanging out of its beak. And he chased the ostrich around the back of the stage and came back out front, and I see Eric, and I see the ostrich, and I'm like, well, where's my handkerchief? And Eric, he's got his white clown makeup on, but through his clown makeup, you could see how red he was in the face. He's just laughing hysterically, and he's pointing at the ostrich saying, he ate it. And so I couldn't finish that particular trick. And if I ever do write my autobiography, which no one would buy, but I got a title. An ostrich ate my handkerchief, but the clown tried to stop it. So after the park closed, and before I moved to the south, I'd come here, and the park was starting to deteriorate from neglect. But then over the next several years, it was heartbreaking. Again, I didn't live here at the time, but when I would come up to visit, I'd still come by and see the elephants. And seeing the, not just age neglect, but the graffiti, it was heartbreaking. It was very sad to come here. And then I found out about the project of the Friends of Benson's Park to revitalize it and make it into a park. And on a personal note, when I left here in '92, I swore I'd never come back other than to visit. But my parents are elderly now. They're both in different stages of dementia. And in 2018, my brother and I moved back up here. I was living in Florida at the time to become full-time caregivers for them. So I come here pretty regularly now, and I'm super impressed with what they've done. It's a beautiful park, peaceful, it's quiet, it's a good place to just collect your thoughts and walk around and enjoy the walking paths and some of the structures that are back here, like the barn, from back in the day. It just brings back memories. I must say it's bittersweet because it's not the same without the animals. Chipmunks aren't tigers. It's not quite the same, but I'm still very impressed. And every time I walk through here, a memory that I hadn't thought of since then, even without, the arena out there anymore, and without my little magic stage down the hill, even without those things, just being there, a memory that, darn, I'd forgotten all about that, will pop into my head, and it's just, it's very cool. Younger people come here and they enjoy the park, I'm sure, but those of us that had it as such a big part of our lives have a real different take on it. Yeah, I guess I'd like to say, I know their current project is to turn the barn into a museum. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I don't even know where I acquired them, but I've got, obviously the photographs that I've taken, I know that I acquired those, but I've also got some from way back, I've got some 8x10s of this park from back in the 50s and times like that, and I haven't seen them in other collections. And I don't remember where I got them from. My parents may have taken them, I don't know. But I'm gonna have them copied, donate them to the museum, and I'm looking forward to it opening. I'm really looking forward to it. And in the meantime, before it's finished and open, I would encourage anyone in this area or even from further away, if you either have memories of Benson's, when it was a park, when it was Benson's Animal Park, or not. It's just a great place to be, and I'd encourage anybody to come visit.